know what, Eddie, as instructors for Midwestern Marks, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about people like Stalin and Mao? If you want, we can actually just, divvy this up into each category for like Stalin, Mao, Castro, and others, if you would like to. But what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you hear about them, and that is easily debunked just through history alone?
I would say, I would say, without getting into any specifics right away, the main misconception is the idea that they purposefully starved people, that Mao and Stalin were such evil bad guys that they hoarded all the grain for themselves and didn't starve people on purpose, right? That's not what happened. Now, Russia and China at the time of the revolution were semi-feudal countries. They were not highly industrialized. They didn't have industrialized agriculture. That was something that needed to be developed and was developed very quickly by the socialist economy. So famines in Russia and in China, feudal China and feudal Russia, had been rampant for years under capitalism or a form of it's basically a mixture between capitalism and feudalism was the kind of mode of production they had. So what socialism did by industrializing agriculture is got rid of those famines forever. Now, there were some famines in the early years of China and Russia, but the reason there hasn't been any famine since is because of the agricultural policies that were taken by the socialists. Now, like in the case of the Soviet Union after the revolution, not only were they not industrialized, but they were put under economic sanctions by the West. They had regime change efforts by, I believe, 9 different Western countries in the few years after the revolution. They had to divert a lot of their economy towards military spending to prepare for the incoming fascist invasion from Germany. So there was less money that they could put towards agriculture and food. So this led to shortages in some areas, but it wasn't shortages that were caused by Stalin because he was an all-powerful dictator who felt like starving people. They were shortages caused by the material conditions, which were conditions that the socialist economies inherited from the economies previous, right? This is what we know from Marxism and historical materialism. You can't just invent socialism tomorrow. We can't just create a utopian society tomorrow. It needs to be built from the society that we've inherited. So that's what the Soviet Union and China were doing when they experienced these famines. And then, of course, that's been taken by Western propagandists like the Black Book of Communism authors, for example, and they extrapolate from data, create the biggest death tolls that they possibly can, and then say all of these people died because of the evil actions of Stalin and Mao.
Just to give a little. Oh, I'm sorry, Eddie.
No, I'm done.
I have this terrible habit of interrupting Eddie. By the way,
I'm done.
Just to add a little to sort of paint the picture of what Eddie's talking about. The famine he's referring to happens around in the early 30s in the Soviet Union. And in 1932, 80% of the agriculture was done with hand implements. The hammer and sickle. That's because the peasantry there were literally still using sickles. And it took the industrialization and collectivization and the free use of tractors for the collective farms, what they called the kolkhozs, to overcome that limitation. And that, that just takes time. But what I really focus on is how these narratives all get proliferated. Because if you listen to what Eddie was just saying, there's sort of a little factual kernel, and then it's spun into this wild narrative where you suddenly, we can't try socialism or else Stalin's going to come and eat your babies and their babies and their babies and all that, Yeah. Always, it takes one thing, divorces it from all of the sort of history that creates it, and then blames it on some sort of evil intent.
Gotcha. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and a lot of times people talk about how Stalin is this totalitarian, autocratic ruler, But in fact, I want to show people something. And Sabby, remember when we talked about this and I brought it up to you. Now, here is proof that Stalin was actually a democratic ruler. And this is from the CIA themselves. Oh, he's sookie. Now we're about to get into it, people. All right, so this is from the CIA, CIA.gov, right? All right, this is from the Central Intelligence Agency, right? And March 2nd, I think it's 52 or 56, something like that. So here's what it says. Number one, it says, even in Stalin's time, there was collective leadership. The Western idea of a dictator within communist setup is exaggerated. Misunderstandings on that subject are caused by a lack of comprehension of the real structure and organization of the communist power structure. Stalin, although holding wide powers, was merely the captain of a team, and it seems obvious that Khrushchev will be the new captain. However, it does not appear that any of the present leaders will rise to the stature of Lenin and Stalin, so it will be safer to assume that developments in Moscow will be along the lines of what is called collective leadership, unless Western policies force the Soviets to streamline their power organization. The present situation is the most favorable from the point of view of upsetting the communist dictatorship since the death of Stalin. But here's the thing. They still call it dictatorship, even though they admitted that it was collective leadership.
So where does that come from then? Like, where does that statement that it was a dictatorship, like, who started that?
There's competing theories on this. Really, anyone who's written a paper in school knows that you need to use primary sources, right? So whenever we look for primary sources on things like this, or like the famines that Eddie was talking about, we go back to a few central places. One is a British intelligence agent named Robert Conquest, who was literally in their misinformation department. Another is Seymour Hersh, the guy that the Rosebud guy, right? From the movie, I forget what it's called. But he was a huge media magnate in the U.S. and a fascist. And not just, he was a mean guy. Like, he was the media liaison to the Nazi Party. He paid Mussolini to write articles for him. Like, he was a fascist. Citizen Kane, thank you.
Got you.
So that's one of the other primary sources. But a lot of it is a sort of misunderstanding of the term dictatorship of the proletariat, right? So the way Marxism views all of society, all of it, is as a contradiction. It's a contradiction in the process of overcoming itself, right? So you have the old decaying part of it, the bourgeois side, which was progressive in the past. And then you have the nascent progressive part of it that moves things forward, the proletarian side. Which class in society has power dictates to the other class, right? Or other classes. Has a democracy within its own class, but dictates to the rest. So a democracy of the bourgeoisie is what we could call the U.S. And they take this term dictator and then run with it. And, a typical media spin about any enemy of our ruling class. They're always evil in some way. And Stalin is the perfect example. I mean, there's a really, really good paper showing how democratic Stalin in particular was by Grover Furr. He's a modern historiographer on the Stalin period of the Soviet Union, called Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform, if anyone's interested. But the 1936 Constitution movement, which was spearheaded by Stalin, was the most democratic sort of way of implementing politics that the world had seen at this time, right? Because for the first time in history, it was the masses that had the sort of democracy of the working class, and all they needed to repress or dictate to was the small minority of the old exploiting class, right? So that they couldn't return.
I think to answer the question more directly, what the Bolsheviks and the Marxists were calling the early stages of socialist governance are dictatorship of the proletariat. Being that under capitalism, you have a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. We both know that, we have two different parties in this country, the Democrats and the Republicans. Who do they serve, though? The economic ruling class. It's a dictatorship of the capitalist class. Whatever the capitalist class says goes. So to combat that, you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, which, yes, is called a dictatorship, but really what it is a dictatorship by the masses. It's mass rule. And in the early stages of socialism, the state apparatus needs to be used to suppress the counter-revolutionaries, the imperialists, the capitalist class who aren't going to go down without a fight. And that's where the term dictatorship of the proletariat comes from, and seizing the state apparatus and using it to benefit the workers rather than the capitalists and create a true democracy.
Yeah.
So recently,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just a quick question. Recently, I know I saw there was a little bit of criticism over this. Recently, I saw that Garland Nixon said that Stalin was fascist. And I think it was, I can't remember if it was Noah or Eddie. It was one of you that pushed back on that. And not everybody that watches the show has Twitter. So could one of you explain to people why that is not necessarily the case?
Yeah, I mean, he just doesn't meet the description of a fascist. And there's this book called The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, which was heavily funded and sponsored by the CIA, which basically argued that communism and fascism were the same thing. And this book came out, I believe, in the 60s or 50s, so after World War II, it ended. And they tried to push this idea that the communists who defeated the Nazis were the same as the Nazis, even though, of course, the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany were mortal enemies, and 80% of German casualties in World War II were dealt by the Soviet Union, who lost 27 million people fighting the German Nazis. So to say that these two were just the same thing is quite ridiculous, but that's the narrative that's been pumped out by the CIA and blasted out over mainstream media and the systems of education that we have in the capitalist world. But, I mean, not only did Stalin beat the Nazis, but if you read Michael Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, you'll see there's no real similarities between the governments or the economic policy. Hitler rose to power on the backs of multinational corporations and business interests within Germany who bankrolled his rise to power. And one of the first things that both he and Mussolini did was send their brown shirts or stormtroopers to kill communists, socialists, labor leaders, and bust up unions. So it basically allowed a corporatocracy to take power in Germany, the same way that a bunch of finance capitalists tried to do here in America with what's known as the business plot. They basically tried a fascist coup against FDR. That's basically what happened in Germany. They were in a state of economic crisis after World War I, and the fascists won out, whereas the communists were killed and suppressed. But in the Soviet Union, it wasn't the case. The workers were able to seize power in a time of economic crisis, and they invested in all these policies of industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, increased literacy from like 17% to 99%, vastly increased wages, vastly increased access to healthcare. These weren't things that happened in Germany. In Germany, basically, things got worse for the working class almost in every way. There were some things that Hitler would throw, like some populist things that he would do to try and win the workers to his side, which is why they were called the National Socialist Party in the first place. He was just trying to capitalize on the popularity of socialism. But in terms of governance, Stalin and Hitler couldn't have been more different.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple other Stalin era policies. Gender equality, right? Women were part of the working class, and there were things like community laundries and cafeterias set up where all of this traditional women's work at the time was done by everybody in order for women to go to work or school. They set up a giant education system, began sending party cadre around. This was a mostly illiterate country before the revolution, right? If you couldn't get to a school, they would send people to your house, to your village, wherever, to make sure you were taught how to read. And that is giant. My grandmother remembers the party people coming and teaching her how to read as a little girl. And she grew up in southern Kazakhstan, by the way. Not only that, anti-racism, huge. There were laws against racist organizing, anti-Semitic organizing. There were Soviets or workers' councils, that's what the word Soviet means, set up to promote the unique interest of all the different ethnic groups within the Soviet Union in the government. It's just huge. Everything we talk about wanting these days, the Soviet Union was actively implementing.
Yeah. One of the things I want to ask you, was I mistaken for saying that Stalin was somebody who was democratic? Because Negras Tormenta says, my God, Stalin was democratic. Please, we shouldn't buy into Western propaganda, but saying Stalin was democratic is ridiculous. Was I ridiculous for saying that?
No, not at all.
That's true. He wanted to implement more democracy before he died.
A lot of this boils down to the creation of preconceptions. And where does that come from? That comes from history. History is what builds the present, right? And in our country specifically, we have this long history of our ruling class pushing anti-communism, because communism historically is the only real threat to their power, whether we call it communism or not, you know? I mean, we can just look at how the Soviet Union was set up and disprove the notion. Just to give you a broad overview, in the early days of the revolution in Russia, there was the dictatorship of the proletariat, and this included only the city working class. The problem was most of the Soviet Union was peasants, right, in rural areas, people like my grandparents. And when Stalin is elected, because he was always elected, people voted yes or no for him, right? This all changes. We get the 36th Constitution, and the peasantry is included into the dictatorship of the proletariat. So they have all the same rights as everybody else. They're voting. But beyond that, the way the government was structured was largely based on a few ways the U.S. was structured in the early days. But what they did was each region or factory or city gets its own Soviet, right? Its own council. And anyone there can stand for that Soviet, can put themselves up for election or be nominated or whatever. They have a vote, right? They create this council, and then that council, out of them and all the others like them, goes to the next level up. So the level of one of our states or a province or what they call an oblast there. And then from that oblast, they go to the next level up. And then the next level up all the way to what they call the Supreme Soviet. And then from there, you get the entire state political structure of the Soviet Union, incredibly democratic. We're just told it's not, you know?
Got it. Do you have any questions, Sabby?
Not so far.
Okay.
Definitely a learning experience, though. Jaybe and I had a long conversation about Stalin before this stream. I think it was a couple nights ago. We had a long conversation about this.
I bet we used one of Stalin's books actually as a textbook in the class Jaybe took of mine. So he's probably been on some Stalin lately. When I first started reading Stalin, you couldn't stop me. He's such a good writer. He's so straightforward, to the point. He comes from a working class background himself, by the way. And he was part of an oppressed minority before the revolution. So him rising to power is a very, very Soviet thing.
So somebody said Holodomor. I've heard people talk about this and debunk this on TikTok, including you, Eddie. People talking about the Holodomor. So can we just go over that real quick, just like 2 minutes?
I think maybe if we're going to talk about the Great Leap Forward later, I can do that. And I think Holodomor is probably Noah's better than me.
Okay. All right.
Pass
cool.
to him.
I can go over it. So we touched on it earlier, right? There, in the early Soviet Union and in the early 30s, they were so far behind the West, right? And they knew they were going to be invaded again. They didn't know when exactly, but they saw fascism rising. They saw, even the Black Hundreds in their own country. From day one, they're invaded by over a dozen imperialist countries. Then there's a civil war. And you have, this comes out of sort of, before the revolution, there was what was called the Stalin land reforms, which was trying to uncollectivize sort of peasant lands that have been collected forever and ever, right? And so they give these specific families, kind of like the westward expansion here in homesteading, except it was only open to specific families, right? So they give them all this land and say, you go out there, you do what you want with it. These become what's called the kulaks, right? Or Stalin at one point called them the Soviet bourgeoisie, right? And there are these people who owned this land that just had more or better resources on it than others, right?
They were just the bigger farmers in the
exactly.
area. They owned the land.
And they get to a point where they can afford better farming implements, etc., and start leasing them out to peasants, right? And this creates a big old antagonism, especially after the revolution. And they have all this industrialization going on, etc. And then a sort of shortage starts hitting. And the kulaks use this to hoard grain, right? Beginning to starve people in the cities while they're charging the state, who's the only one buying it, about a 400% markup. And so they start requisitioning this from them and then just start taking it because people are starving. This is one part, right? Another part is throughout collectivization, which was the process that begins at a grassroots level of these peasants getting together and collectively farming, starting these collective farms, that the state then ends up supporting, right? You have the kulaks sabotaging this. This escalates into violence over and over and over again. Finally, the state and the Communist Party send people to help. And they obviously come down on the side of the collective farms. Just to give you an idea of how they originally tried to begin, though, what they did wasn't to sort of start going out and killing kulaks, right? They incentivized creation of new collective farms by giving subsidies, by giving free seed, et cetera, et cetera. And the rate of collective farming is sort of like they covered maybe 15% of the grain sales in 1930, I want to say. By 33, it was 80%, right?
Kind of like co-op farming, like something like that. Okay.
Precisely what it is. What this was on a theoretical level, and this was Stalin's sort of point, was this was a transition to a socialist way of doing things for people that had a more peasant mindset, a social consciousness coming out of that sort of stratum of society, right? But anyway, this shortage hits, and kulaks begin, as they're sort of getting their farms taken by the grassroots movement, slaughtering their own livestock, burning their grain, leaving it to rot, etc. After this, there were less than half of the livestock in the Soviet Union than there was previous. So they killed in order to just drive up prices and prevent their private property being collectivized over half the livestock in the entire country.
So it's basically like if we can't have it, nobody can.
Exactly. It was taking my ball and going home, right? It was crazy. But lastly, this wasn't a huge thing, right? It wasn't this giant famine with millions dying. It wasn't. There were shortages, there were deaths, right? But it's a lot more complicated than that, than just, giant murderous commies or whatever.
And
right?
what's interesting is a lot of people wish Stalin would have gone in right away and put a stop to the kulaks, but he kept trying to do things the nice way. So it's actually, he was less dictatorial than he's made out to be.
Exactly.
And some have argued that he should have been more authoritarian.
And so we get the stories of this here through Hearst and the Hearst media machine, right? And if you look into Holodomor, like there's a book on it by anti-communists called "Why Is One Holocaust Worse Than the Other?" where they downplay the actual Holocaust, by the way, talking about the alleged millions of Jews killed by the Nazis and all kinds of horrible stuff. But if you track that or any other book on this back to the primary sources, you get to these Hearst articles. And his main source on this, which was a guy named, I believe his name is Thomas Walker, who took these photos throughout what he said was his time in the Soviet Union, right? He was there for maybe 2 weeks. He all of the photos that he supposedly had, you can look these up on a Google image search, were actually photos of earlier famines. Like there was an earlier famine in Volga. Some were photos from World War I. There's a story he put out about a man who starved right next to his horse. It was just a picture of a guy next to a dead horse. I don't know why you wouldn't eat the horse. Just weird stuff. He ends up getting arrested for something completely immaterial. By the way, it was, I think, it was a slavery law involving trafficking women across state lines for purposes of sex. This is what he gets arrested for. And all of the lies he told in the Hearst papers come out. So originally, even Americans didn't believe this stuff. It all came out in the trial, right? He got kicked out of the Soviet Union for trying to smuggle an old white guard, the Tsarist soldiers, into a factory to sabotage it. He was fired from 2 jobs there for loafing. He was basically a con man. He'd also been arrested for, I think it was called marriage swindle at the time. This, along with a bunch of Nazis, are the primary sources for the Holodomor, which means mass murder through hunger.
Or Anne Applebaum, who's a Western writer, not a historian, who's been debunked by Robert Conquest and Mark Tauger, who are Soviet agronomists, or one of them's a Soviet agronomist. I don't know what the other one studies, but they're not communists. And they've looked at Applebaum's work and dissected it and debunked it systematically. And I just want to add, the Canadian government now heavily funds these Holodomor education programs where they literally have a Holodomor bus with like Ukrainian genocide painted on the side, and it drives around and tells people that the Holodomor happened and raises awareness for the Holodomor. So it's something that the ruling class has put a lot of money into perpetuating.
Fun fact, real quick, the people in Ukraine who were propagating this myth was the OUN, Stepan Bandera's organization, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the party that was so extreme in their anti-Semitism and pogroms that the German Nazi party, when they got to Ukraine during the war, were like, dude, you guys got to chill on this anti-Semitism. They were that extreme. These are the progenitors of the modern neo-Nazis in Ukraine.
That tea is delicious.
Wow. I know. That was a lot.
Wow.
Oh man.
Woo. Wow. That's really interesting.